Hey, what's up? Just did you buckle your seatbelt? Okay. Yeah, welcome to On the Move. Yeah, I know. It's a one-sided conversation. I don't know what to tell you. You've listened to this many. The sound quality sucks. I hear you. Yeah, the car is noisy. I don't use AI to clean it up. It's not really edited that well. The shows are different lengths, there's no consistency. I don't really have a topic. It's, it is what it is, right? It's On the Move. We're it's not going to be the big popular podcast, right? It's not going to get a big groundswell of interest. It's got the one or the two loyal listeners, and then the rest of the people kind of come and go. They pecking at the bread pan, picking out dough. Is that outdoors, like out dough, or is it actual dough, like it's picking out dough? Picking at the bread pan, picking out dough. I don't know. It's like, could be either, I guess. That drawl. Oh my goodness. Cruising around, gonna get my fill of homelessness here. Tent cities are cropping up all over. Can you blame them? Can you blame anyone who can't keep up with this economy? We're just going to see more and more, I guess. No relief. And then, whatever. I'm not going down that area. I wanted to talk about animation again, maybe, instead of, politics and, news and stupid shit. I wanted to talk about a personal project that I did some years ago. Gosh, 16 years ago now. I premiered it in Portland. My short film, Fred. Yeah, Fred. Fred's got a little cachet of interest. There's people that like that film. And I wanted to talk about my journey on Fred, and how I made it, and what was involved in making it. So I'm doing like a 3-part series on Fred. And I wanted to start with the first part, which is the conception of the idea, and then the writing of the idea, and some of the pre-production. So even on my very, very, very first job, I started feeling kind of an angst. When you first start animating out of college, I made a couple films in college. I didn't graduate, and then I showed those films to a company down in the Bay Area, and I worked on a show called Bump in the Night. Sort of late 93, I started animating professionally. And I just left school. I didn't go back to finish. I never got a degree. I only really have a high school diploma. So if And when I've taught over the years, I've had to teach at private universities. And sometimes I'll do little guest lectures and stuff. But everybody in the collegiate and in the education realm wants a degree. That's how you kind of make money as a teacher, is by getting a degree. Or multiple degrees, Jesus. The more degrees you have, the more valuable you are to them, and the more money you make. So I never really made much money teaching, but I do enjoy teaching. But you make this adjustment out of school, and that adjustment is like, okay, I'm a free artist making my own shit, and suddenly now I'm a paid artist and I'm working for a studio, and you're just sort of a hired gun, and you clock in and clock out, and you definitely learn sort of industry standard practices. You get good at what you do, but it makes you want to do your own thing even more, because now you kind of have a higher skill level. So I think there's two kinds of animators. There's like the animators that don't really care about their personal work, and then there's the animators that they obsess and they think about their personal work all the time. I'm kind of like in the latter camp. I constantly am trying to create ideas, and within the first 3 years of my career, I immediately discovered that you get on the you get on the treadmill of your professional life, the hustle, and you realize, oh God, there's not a whole lot of time for personal work, and there's not a whole lot of money, and you get swallowed up by being an adult, which is the scam of society, whatever. And unless you're writing grants, or you're made of money, or you're able to sort of like, I don't know, you marry some rich guy or whatever, you're just not, you can very easily lose track and touch with personal endeavors. Because the promise in college, oftentimes, or at least in my case it was, is that you're learning animation, which is probably one of the most incredible art forms and languages to express creatively something. Because you're imbuing it, the art form, I've gone over this so many times, but the art form involves lighting, composition, sculpture, hair, costume, animation, movement, art, painting, poetry, writing, music, sound effects, wardrobe, all of it. So you're expressing in this very sophisticated moving image language creative ideas. And it's a lot. It's a lot to tackle and do when you don't have the time and or the money. So I was kind of spinning my wheels. I was in the Bay Area. I was trying to make my rent. But this was in the 90s, and honestly, stuff was pretty cheap back then. You could get a flat for like $800 or something, you know what I mean? Like you could get, maybe not that cheap. I think my one bedroom apartment. I had a studio, one bedroom apartment, Alamo Square area of San Francisco for probably $1,200, maybe 1,000, 950, something like that. And then because I was kind of, my work was sort of spotty, but it was coming in. I was able, and I didn't really have overhead. I didn't have a car. Great town for not having a car. We didn't have expensive phones or, water, power, electric. Everything was kind of cheap. But I was able to afford a studio, and I shared a studio space with two other people, Mike Eater and Gerald Howard. We had a little space, and it was right around the corner from where I lived, and it was great. It was fantastic. It was very like, okay, this is a space for me to create the things that I want to create. So I started kind of scheming and dreaming, and I went through a whole array of different ideas, and I did a lot of start stops on personal projects that were kind of considerations of ideas, like I called them kind of pipe dreams. I was smoking a lot of weed. I was like sketching in my sketchbook. I was really into sci-fi. I was into adventure and dystopian futures. I was into Blade Runner. I was into robotics, and I loved Star Wars and Alien and dark dystopian sci-fi. And so I was doing some of that, like building weird puppets and doing little tests, but I wasn't writing. There was no cohesive, centralized idea. It wasn't like I was, trying to turn a Philip K. Dick idea into some short story or, some poem or something. I had nothing holding it together. And yet I had this burning desire to express something and to push the medium and to, I was starting to kind of get a little bit bitter. I'd work these jobs and I would be constantly thinking like, oh God, we can make cooler puppets than this, or we can express more than we're expressing in this silly way. I felt like a lot of the projects I worked on were very one-dimensional, very like, you're on a commercial selling a product, or you're on a TV series, and it just requires sort of wooden, predictable performances, and it's all aimed and geared towards an audience that was not me. It was usually like kid stuff. So I decided I needed to write something, and I started writing the script for Fred. And it started out as a series of sort of monologues. I call them dialogues because he's essentially talking to himself. At one point he does talk to his boss, Jim. But it's really just Fred having a conversation with himself. And I wrote quite a long script. And the analogy was sort of like this beginning, middle, end. It's like he doesn't want to go to work, which was essentially what I was kind of going through. It's funny that has really shifted in my life. I really enjoy going to work now. And I feel so blessed and lucky to, even on the silliest of jobs, to shove objects around frame at a time just feels like such a privilege, And, but I was making my adjustment into full-fledged adulthood, the awkward kind of 20s. you're more full of angst and anger as a little man child. You're working hard, but you're also going out and blowing off a lot of steam, and you're just trying to negotiate the ins and outs of working in groups on things that you don't really have very much control over. And I think there's a stark contrast between in school when you're doing exactly what you want to do and it's very much about self-expression, and then the workplace where you're fulfilling the desires of other people and trying to sort of please and fit in and be valuable to someone else's needs. And I still had some heavy duty things to express. I'm naturally a person that questions everything. And this, when I started writing, Fred, it was, let's see here, it was the late 90s. And I'd already been working almost a decade in stop motion. And and the Bay Area was shifting. It was becoming kind of like the Silicon Valleys. It was the dot-com era. Money was just flooding into the internet, which was so kind of fresh and new. Everybody had these dial-up modems, and it was slow, and we were trying to figure out what entertainment or interactivity even look like on this new platform. And there were all these startup companies that were trying to figure out an optimized way to present moving pictures and media. Flash was big because it was a vector-based, sort of low, there were no heavy, the pixel-based media was heavier to stream. But vector-based stuff, it was more of a streamlined. So a lot of 2D started kind of moving into Flash, and Flash players were big in the 90s. And networks were strong. Everybody had cable, and they were watching traditional TV. Everything stop motion was still shot on film, 35 millimeter film, and then transferred to video and edited, color corrected, and yada yada. And so the shows were still kind of like made like you would make a moving picture film, like a feature film. And luckily for me, I was sharing a studio with a person that worked in the camera department, this guy Mike Eater, and he had his own 35 millimeter Mitchell camera. And so when we would shoot things, we would shoot them on 35. And so digital really wasn't there quite yet. But this is the environment that I started writing Fred in. And I started I've always journaled, and I've always kept sketchbooks, and I've always, written, whether it's just thoughts or poems or short stories or, little comic books. I pack sketchbooks. I've got a closet full of sketchbooks that are just like, the beginnings of ideas, the beginnings of films, the beginnings of comic books, the beginnings of novels and short stories and stuff. So, or screenplays. But I was into weird shit, and I was convinced that something was happening in society. And I kind of saw this trend. We were looking at the dot-com era. All this money was going into tech. And suddenly everybody switched to cell phones. Um, and cell phones became this ubiquitous thing. And I immediately fought it. I was like, I was not on board with being reachable 247. I didn't like this idea of holding something in your pocket that anybody at any time could either text or call you. I liked the free and easy, like if you're out and about, you get on a payphone. If you're out and about, maybe you don't meet the person you were trying to meet. You had a landline at home with an answering machine, and you could write letters. Like, if you really want to communicate with your mom, you fucking call her up, and you would have an actual conversation. I could just sort of tell. And then I was also really suspicious of the technology. There was a little tingle in the back of my head that was telling me that this was all bullshit. I didn't know that it was going to turn into the silent weapons surveillance state monstrosity it is now. But I had a sixth sense that it was complete horseshit. And, we would just be pummeled with telecommunication ads, like AT&T or Verizon or can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? It was like this guy with glasses and a little zip up, I called it the zipped up .com look, like this conservatively dressed nerd was trying to sell you on cell phones, and it looked like conformity, was the flavor du jour. That it was the wolf in sheep's clothing. It was like, okay, let's get out of the wild and crazy 90s where self-expression is a big thing and music is a big thing and getting together in groups is a big thing. And let's get into the staying at home, staring at a computer, and having a cell phone on your body 247. And it felt like I was looking at the pod people. Like, people were losing their personalities, losing their wild, abandoned self-expression. Like, just spirit of freedom was kind of going away. And so I started writing some of these ideas into Fred. There's a whole subplot that I was working on. When he confronts himself at the mirror, it was like, you can't control me. You can't own me. It was me sort of, trying to plant my flag in the ground and make a plea, like, or set some sort of boundary against this tidal wave that was hitting society, where the assumption was that everybody's on board with this. And I was questioning all of it. I was like, so how do these cell towers work? Oh, they're line of sight microwave emitters. Microwave, like cooking your food? So in other words, cities now have microwaves running through that. Like, how does that work? I mean, isn't that penetrate your skin and bone and flesh and stimulate your like organs, and like that can't be healthy. And lo and behold, they had done experiments on Nazis had done experiments on mind control with using fluoride and microwaves. So I was like, wow, okay, we have fluorinated water, and now our communication system is microwave based. Like, okay, you don't have to be an Einstein to put two and two together that this looks like some kind of mind control apparatus. And, I mean, that sounds like tinfoil hat conspiracy, right? But that's where I was at. I was like looking around me going, it looks like people are becoming more docile, more conservative, more compliant, more cardboard. I called it the pod people, I really did. And Fred was there was a bunch of dialogue in my early version of the script that was essentially saying like, no, I'm not on board with any of this. So that was the original dialogue he was having with his own reflection backstage at the theater. And I cut a lot of that, and I just honed it down to its essence. It's a 3-act short story that is like, I don't want to go. Fuck you. You don't own me. You don't control me. Okay, I'm going to go. Reluctant compliance. And it's like he's born, he lives, and then he dies. And when he exits to the stage, he exits the backstage and he goes onto the stage with his little pogo stick. He's going to heaven. He's bouncing out of this realm into the next. And that was kind of like and I had written into it this whole sort of like color script. The doorknob he comes through at the beginning is red. The door that says "You're Nuts" on it has orange, so we have red, orange, and so chapter 2 is the door that enters into the backstage, and then he sees his boss, which is like this splash of yellow, red, orange, yellow, and then when he starts to change into his outfit, he has green. And then it kind of fell apart at that point. But these are things I was really thinking about. These are things I wanted to sort of implant in the audience. I was definitely sort of operating on an unconscious level with my expression of this stuff. I wanted to sneak deeper messages into kind of a very simple story. And the design of it was, what is a totally broke asshole like me on a shoestring budget able to actually produce? There's one set. It's kind of broken into 2 parts. There's the hallway and the backstage, but it was all attached to one another, and it was one big giant set. So it was one set, one puppet. Although Jim, his boss, is a shadow on the wall, but I didn't have to build an additional puppet. That was just clay on glass with a light, projecting onto the door. So it was one puppet, one set, essentially. And the set was small enough to pack into these bicycle boxes so I could move from city to city. I started shooting it in San Francisco. I rented a studio above Popeye's Chicken in the Mission, and I used to walk from the Western Addition neighborhood. A good 45-minute walk, and during my walk, I would plan my entire day. I recommend this to people. I would sip green tea. I don't know why I was on a green tea and then I would plan my day. And so the very first thing I did was I wrote the script, and I recommend if anybody is making a short film, write a script. Don't go into a personal project without a fucking story. Write the damn script. How many movies have we heard where people are still working on the script and they're cutting scenes and they're doing this and they're doing that? We know the people that operate like this. And what do? They make garbage, right? They don't make tight little Hitchcock, perfect films that are, crystalline logic. They make partial messages that don't have any ending. And so I gotta get going. I'm gonna wrap up this portion here. So the very first thing I did was I recorded my dad's good friend, Don Heitzer, had this wonderful voice. Growing up, Don Heitzer used to come over to my house. He was an AD in Hollywood. He AD'd like countless films, like really cool shit. I think he did Paris, Texas, and a bunch of Van Damme films, and Transylvania 65000, Beetlejuice. He AD'd Beetlejuice. Jesus Christ, right? His IMDb is like fucking long as your leg. It's pretty impressive. Don Heitzer. Anyway, he used to come over after. If you know anything about ADing live action, it's one of the hardest jobs you can possibly do. You're yelling at everybody on the mic. You're keeping the show on budget, on schedule, right? So he would just be pulling his hair out with anxiety and adrenaline, and then he would crash. He would come over to our house after a fucking stressful show, and he would roll up a big joint, and my parents would just pour him a huge glass of wine, and he would just like crack jokes and tell stories, and his voice cooked into my head. And when I became an animator and I wanted to make my own film, I immediately thought, okay, the voice of Fred needs to be Don Heitzer. So I recorded Don, and Don took the role very serious. He was like, okay, if I'm going to act, then I need to prove to you that I'm an actor. And he was retired at this point, living in gold country, like Northern California, and out in the sticks. And he lived in this geodesic dome, and he had a parrot that would sit on his shoulder, and he just was a total pirate character. He would feed the deer and the rabbits and stuff around his house, and smoke loads of weed, and watch movies, and write trippy scripts. And he was just a totally like funny, interesting, unique, retired stoner, essentially. But so he lived in, oh god, what was it, like this tiny little town, Grass Valley. And he said, okay, well, I'm going to join the local theater and I'm going to start acting because I need to learn the craft of acting. He'd been around actors his whole career. But he didn't half-step this little 6.5-minute script that I showed him. He took it very serious. And I went and I watched him in a play of 12 Angry Men. And he was one of the jurors. And he just did a smoking job. And he got along with the other actors really well. And he just had a great presence on stage. And I was like, this is amazing. And so after that experience, we went and we recorded Fred. And it was like gold. Vinnie Ferraro was Jim, and they both met me at this recording studio in Northern California, like just north of San Francisco. And we did, I don't know, several takes in different styles. I had Don like whisper the lines and then, modulate volume and get really intimate. And he had so much range. And then he played so well with Vinny, so I had Vinny and him do it at the same time in the booth together. I did it separately. And then I took all this audio and I edited down. And then I realized with the audio I could change the story even more by cutting lines here and there. And so it became this different animal after recording. And then I started storyboarding. And I made an animatic, like a legit, real deal animatic. And I had a timeline with my short film on it. And it felt really good to be able to like start production with that template. Like, okay, this is the film I'm making. And by the time I built the puppet and set and lit it, I knew exactly how long every shot was, and I knew exactly what I was attempting to say with each shot. So that is part 1 of my journey making Fred. Wow, 36 minutes of boredom. Congratulations for making it through that much. Stay tuned for part 2 on the move.